This paper is supposed to look at the aspects of regional cooperation. I think there are at least two major groupings. One were the papers which looked at the individual countries, which we had the presentations yesterday, and the second is about the way forward if and when we have cooperation among countries, among various groupings. So I'll just spend the next 15 to 20 minutes on the work that has been done and what is in future. The outline of this presentation is I set the stage with the background on a note about regional cooperation and the low carbon energy systems, and then I'll share the proposed paper outline, and then the framework for the study and the methodology adopted to conduct the study, followed by the analysis and discussion on essentially the 5 principles for regional cooperation, which has been discussed earlier, as well as the indicators, as Dr. Anbu mentioned. I look at the indicators at 2 types, one of the qualitative and a little bit descriptive, and the second one is the quantitative type, which is essentially coming from the OECD framework of SCEA, but more focused towards the low energy systems. It is clear that the developing economies are going to contribute to a large extent in the global economic growth. And in this economic growth, of course, there are 4 major drivers. The major drivers, I would say, the energy, the type of technologies being used, the capacity, which also includes both the institutional as well as the human capacity, as well as the infrastructure. Our focus essentially here is on energy, which essentially could be driven either by fossil fuel based systems or by non-fossil fuel based systems. And our interest here is on the non-fossil fuel based system, which is essentially the low carbon systems, considering the need to address the global climate change issues, which I think has been made very clear that it's not a luxury anymore, it's definitely an imperative option. When you look at the low carbon energy systems, for the number of advantages, and I just highlighted few here because these are the advantages which we would later consider when we discuss the indicators, which is on energy security for the countries, the availability of resources, as by nature renewable resources are locally available, and of course contributing to the GHG mitigation. And obviously these are going to be promoted essentially by the policies which promote renewable energy, which promotes energy efficiency, the prices, and of course there are other drivers which can give a sort of an impetus, which is the regional cooperation, free trade agreements, and institution building. And it's clear that there are both the market forces in terms of creating a conducive climate to promote regional cooperation, as well as the non-market, which is essentially on, could be on capacity building and developing regional centers for innovation. Regional cooperation by itself can, when it works well, can be definitely a win-win situation for the countries. This becomes quite an advantageous situation because it enables the countries to use their resources in a very productive manner. In fact, the importance of regional cooperation has been emphasized, as well as we can see in the 5th assessment report, which devotes a chapter specifically for regional cooperation and development. Now, coming to the context here, the countries which I have been basically asked to look is the CLM countries, the Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, within the framework of the GMS, or the Greater Mekong Sub-region, which lies under the ASEAN. We see that the governance structure and the differences are there in the countries, both in terms of GDP, physical, human infrastructure, but they also have certain similarities. And of course, the countries also aim to have good growth as well. And in addressing this, obviously the indicators can be of quite great relevance. I just go back to the overall objective of this whole study, in which we are all contributing, is to look at the energy and resource recovery policy options. Here it says the major economies, and in this case these three countries probably individually do not contribute too much, but of course as a group they can be of importance, based on some scenario analysis, as well as to look at the regional economic integration activities. So within this broad context, my interest essentially has been to see how regional cooperation can enhance the economic growth in the CLM countries through the low carbon systems. Specifically, some of the questions which I tried to answer, which would help in developing the paper, is how effective is regional cooperation, looking specifically at energy resource development and deployment compared with individual nation systems. So what would happen if it is done individually by the countries or through a regional cooperation? Essentially looking at promoting low carbon systems, what would happen to reducing GHG emissions, could it reduce or not, and whether it can enhance energy security for each of the countries. Now, the second type of question for which we are looking for answers is how to promote low carbon systems in these countries, and in this case how energy trade can be used, and what are the measures and options available to provide capacity and institutional building, and the financial mechanisms which could be made available just on a regional basis, considering sometimes the specific intricacies and needs of these countries where, for example, the access to electricity is rather weak compared to the other ASEAN countries. So the questions are essentially aimed at looking at the three countries here. So the paper outline essentially would be a background or introduction which looks at the need of low carbon systems, the importance of regional cooperation, the use of indicators, the need for indicators, and then talk about the objective and scope. And then I plan to write the methodology of the overall framework and the specificities of each. And the framework essentially looks at the principles of regional cooperation, which has been developed earlier, and then a study about the CLM countries' status, the energy policies, and then the regional energy resource development and indicators essentially, followed by discussion and conclusion of the particular study. So this is what I aim to do over the next couple of weeks. The methodology essentially is first to look at the cooperation issues and then the current status, and the study essentially will look at the indicators considering both qualitative and quantitative depending upon the framework about which we are looking at, the options for cooperation and the type of impacts expected. And in the quantitative studies, I benefited from a similar study conducted recently, which looked at these cooperation issues with scenario analysis, and then used the indicators of the OECD to look at the energy security and environmental performance. Just to set the stage for the CLM countries, this table essentially gives the population, where you can see there's at least about 9 times difference between the minimum and the maximum. The GDP per capita, as we can see, is quite the same, and the economic growth over the previous years is fairly similar. But of course, there are other different variations between even these three countries. Just to give a background about the indicators framework looks at 3 major groupings. The first is the economic activities, which looks at both the production side and consumption side. And second is the natural asset base, within which the resources are going to be taken and which also used as a sink, and how these are managed by the policies, measures and actions being taken. Now the indicators need to be analytically sound, need to be measurable and also need to have the policy relevance. So all this would be further discussed in the paper. The types of indicators broadly are about 6 major groupings. Of course, for this particular study, I would not be able to look at each of them, but only that focuses on the low carbon systems. The category of indicators could be distinguished in terms of economic and social factors, in terms of resource productivity and environment. One grouping will look at the carbon sink base and the quality of life, the policy responses, and the capacity building and skill development. So under each of these categories, you could have quite a number of specific indicators. Now coming to the quantitative study, this is based on a study which looked at the implications of the energy resource development and trade due to regional cooperation. The study was done for GMS regions, which also includes Thailand and Vietnam. So there are 5 countries, and also the province of Yunnan, because GMS also is constituted by that. But what I'm going to present, the results is only that is specific to the CLM countries. The time frame of this study was for 2000 to 2035, which basically uses the long-term least cost energy system bottom-up model markup. It was interesting that the overall idea was to see, considering individual national energy systems and due to regional cooperation, the integrated system. It looked at 4 major scenarios: a base case and then an unrestricted energy trade case. The other 2 looks at putting up specific energy emission, carbon emission reduction targets. So this gives some of the results which are specific to Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam, which looks at the unrestricted case compared to the base case. So power generation capacity, the net energy import ratio, and the fossil fuel dependency ratio. So these are at least the 3 different categories where I have tried to look at what would happen in case of a base case and what would happen in case of an unrestricted energy trade. For example, we can see in the case of Cambodia, the changes are fairly minimum, whereas in the case of Laos and Myanmar, the changes are mostly positive, in the sense that in case of the net energy import ratio is negative, which basically means they are net exporters of energy. And in case of the fossil fuel dependency, again, the dependency of fossil fuels is much less. Essentially what it means is, in an unrestricted case of good energy cooperation, there will be development of more renewable resources in this region. Of course, this also, as I mentioned, includes the other countries as well. Now, coming to the 5 premises, the free trade in low carbon technology and services. Of course, liberalization of trade and reduced tariff rates would acknowledge technology transfer. We need to again consider the fact that in these countries the situations are of even basic electricity access is pretty weak. Now, what we see is the power generation capacity is the same both in base case and other scenarios. If you look at the table, you will find differences, but for GMS, globally, it's going to be the same. It will decrease slightly for Cambodia and increase mainly for Laos and Myanmar, and these would be mainly by renewables, which I think helps in promoting low carbon development. In terms of energy security, there are 2 indicators where it's clearly seen that there will be greater diversification of energy resources within the GMS region. And what is interesting is the dependence of imports from rest of the world becomes less. So they become more sort of integrated. If you look at the emission targets, the emission, normally having free trade would also have to be linked with the national policies, because to decrease the carbon leakages. And in these countries, technologies are basically imported, and noting the electricity access is poor in these countries, there could be some mechanisms for promoting development of the technologies in this region. If you look at the second premise, which is on integration of carbon markets, we find that when you do this regional cooperation, this will be beneficial with reduced energy system cost, both for Laos and Cambodia, but it will be slightly higher for Myanmar. It's slightly higher for Myanmar in 2035, mainly because of the fact that it is generating more from renewables, which is mainly for export. So this can be an excellent avenue for these Mekong countries to increase access to electricity as well as to mitigate GHG emissions. Now, if you look at the GHG emissions, then in an unrestricted case, without considering even the targets, the total emissions would be 5% less than the base case. There will be some increases in Myanmar, mainly because of the fact of increased use of LPG in the households, where the current usage is fairly low. But the changes will not be significant in Cambodia, but there will be significant decrease in Laos. The financial reserves are definitely an important avenue to promote low carbon development in these countries, and we see there are already some measures, for example by ADB, which help in this particular direction. In terms of regional innovation systems, we see that currently there are not many, but then there could be some sort of development of special economic zones which could help the low carbon strategy, and which can also be a testing ground for new technologies. So that's definitely a possibility. If you look at the AR5, which looks at the regional sort of, I won't call it specifically innovation here, they have tried to classify it to be the promotion on climate specific, on technology focused and trade related, and the ones marked in red are essentially in the ASEAN region, which gives an example of the already existing quite close cooperation. Happy to note the Cogen 3, which was housed at AIT, is also noted there. In terms of partnership for collective learning, this is definitely an important aspect for regional cooperation. For example, they could work on minimum energy efficiency standards, develop measuring, reporting of MRV standards for low carbon infrastructure projects. We have had experience on such initiatives. One is the 3 regional programs supported by the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency in the late 90s and 2000s, and I'm really happy to see Dr. Bunrod here and Dr. Pham, who are part of this regional initiative called Renewable Energy Technologies in Asia, and the Asian Regional Program on Energy, Environment and Climate, Asian Regional Program on Environmental Technologies, where more than 7 countries participated. More recently, we have the CTCF, which has been established through the UNFCCC, and we have at least 2 members here, both AIT and TERI, who are part of this group, where countries can make requests for assisting them towards low carbon development. So just a few strategies which could be considered. One is on cooperation in the deployment of REDs with the focus on building R&D and manufacturing capacities and supporting dissemination. Second, on promoting regional power generation, which already is happening bilaterally between many countries in the GMS, which started quite early, which will help in reducing the dependence on oil and coal imports, and considering mechanisms to speed up diffusion of energy efficiency standards, because otherwise the dirty technologies could be easily transferred elsewhere. This could be done by, for example, setting up a low carbon zone. In adaptation studies, normally they have this green corridor and things like that, so if something like that could be considered. Lastly, but not the least, is also the regional research networks, wherein the countries could join to work together. These are some of the initial strategies which could be considered for expansion and studies. I would just like to conclude that the work is obviously in progress, and it's clear that regional cooperation can help promote low carbon systems and definitely bring additional co-benefits to these countries. Both the market forces and the non-market initiatives are important to push through this. It's made clear, and the qualitative and quantitative indicators can be used to demonstrate the trend and help the policymakers in moving towards more regional cooperation. It's not that we are starting in vacuum. There are already some initiatives, and of course we can learn from other regions like EU, TS, and also from South America on some of the interesting initiatives. I've taken a little bit more time, but thank you very much.